Hello, everybody, and welcome to Churchill and the Making of the Middle East. This event is being staged by the International Churchill Society, which exists to promote interest in the memory, study, and historic legacy of Sir Winston Churchill. You can find out more, including how to join, by going to the website winstonchurchill.org. I'm Alan Packwood, Director of the Churchill Archive Centre at Churchill College, Cambridge, and I'm going to be acting as your Master of Ceremonies. And my very first duty is to thank our sponsors this evening, LL&P Philanthropies. We certainly have a lot to cover in our allotted 2 hours. And in the course of this time, our expert panel is going to be taking you back in time 100 years to the spring of 1921, because it's now just over a century since the Cairo conference and the subsequent discussions in Jerusalem were convened to make, or perhaps we should say, to remake large swathes of the Middle East. Like Winston Churchill, then British Colonial Secretary, and his specialist expert advisors, Lawrence of Arabia and Gertrude Bell, we will be traveling to Cairo and then on to Jerusalem to examine the aspirations, protagonists, and results of a remarkable event that undoubtedly shaped the region as we know it today. In the first hour, we're going to introduce the most famous attendees at the Cairo conference and examine what they hoped to achieve. And in the second hour, we're going to be looking at the results and discussing the legacy for the region. There'll be a chance to visit the Imperial War Museum's fascinating exhibition on Churchill in the Middle East. And we also hope that there's going to be plenty of time for discussions and for Q&A. And if you want to ask a question, please do so using the Zoom Q&A function. So let me set the context. In fact, in 1921, the term Middle East was only just coming into use. The new term to describe an area that, following the aftermath of the final collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War, was suddenly the subject of intense interest to the victorious imperial powers of Britain and France. The secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 had divided the region between the wartime allies. But by the end of the war, the agreed boundaries had shifted slightly to take account of the realities on the ground, while the Bolshevik Revolution had removed Russia from the equation. So that broadly speaking, post-war, the French took modern-day Syria and Lebanon, and the British Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, and Palestine, including modern-day Jordan. The intention of the post-war peace treaties was that these territories were to be administered as mandates under the League of Nations until they were ready to govern themselves. But of course, this was a settlement that was imposed on the peoples of the region, forced onto the Arab and Jewish populations who had already begun to develop their own aspirations for independence. Moreover, it was a solution that was further complicated by the competing ambitions of the Hashemite leader, Sharif Hussein, and the powerful Wahhabi ruler, Ibn Saud, complicated by the presence of both Sunni and Shiite Muslims, and by the seemingly contradictory promises that had been made by Britain to the Arab and Jewish peoples during the First World War. The British High Commissioner to Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, had written to Hussein promising Arab independence as the reward for the Arab Revolt against the Ottoman Turks. Hussein's son, Prince Faisal, had been encouraged by the British to take Damascus, declaring himself king in Syria, only to be thrown out after the war by the French. Meanwhile, the Balfour Declaration of November 1917, named for the British Foreign Secretary, had agreed to a Jewish homeland in Palestine. It was not surprising then that after the war, the situation remained confused, with the British left wondering how to fill the vacuum left by the Ottomans and unsure how to deal with the territories that they had acquired and uncertain of their value, with oil yet to be discovered. Local discontent quickly became violent, and the British found themselves facing popular uprisings in Egypt and in Iraq. And I haven't even mentioned the attitude of France or America. In 1939, Churchill famously described Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. His words would seem equally apt for the Middle East in 1921. The problem facing the British in the post-war period was how to manage these new commitments, how to reconcile the promises that had been made in war while ensuring that the cost of peacetime administration be kept as low as possible. And the man to whom Prime Minister Lloyd George gave this vexed issue, one might say a poisoned chalice, was his long-term political ally, Winston Churchill, newly appointed as Secretary of State for the Colonies. Only 46 years of age, Churchill already had an extremely high and controversial public profile. He had come out of the First World War with his reputation damaged. He'd started the conflict as First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian minister in charge of the largest fleet in the world, but he'd lost office over his advocacy of the unsuccessful Dardanelles campaign, serving a period in political exile, including a few months as a battalion commander on the Western Front. Lloyd George had brought him back into government as Minister for Munitions, and then into the cabinet as Secretary of State for War and Air. But his new appointment in 1921 at the Colonial Office was a chance for him to remake his reputation on the international stage. Never afraid to be dramatic or visible, Churchill gambled on imposing his solution to the problems of the Middle East at a high-level conference. And he summoned the most famous Arabists of the day, Lawrence of Arabia and Gertrude Bell, as well as others. He called this gathering his 40 Thieves. And after much discussion in London, he convened proceedings in the luxury of the Semiramis Hotel in Cairo on the 12th of March, 1921. And of course, this was to be a conference of two halves, and 12 days later, on the 24th of March, the whole affair moved to Jerusalem, where Churchill met with Hussein's brother, Prince Abdullah, the new candidate for the throne of Jordan, but also heard directly from Arab and Jewish deputations about the future of Palestine. We'll come on to discuss the results of the conference later, but I want to start by asking our panelists to introduce the main protagonists and explain what they aimed to achieve at the conference. Full biographies of our speakers are available on the website, so I'm going to keep the introductions brief so that we can move this along quickly. And I'm going to start by turning to my good friend, Dr. Warren Doctor, author of the book Churchill and the Islamic World, and now director of the East Tennessee Historical Association. So Warren, thank you very much for leaving the Blue Mountains behind for an afternoon and for revisiting your work on Churchill. And I hope that you can kick us off by telling us how Churchill approached the Cairo conference and what he was hoping to achieve. Warren.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm not sure if my video is working or not.
It is.
Yeah, your video is working, Warren.
Excellent, thank you. So first of all, I would like to thank you all for coming and listening. And I would like to thank the International Churchill Society, as well as Alan for his kind introduction. And I'm very, very pleased to be speaking here because this is, of course, my area of expertise and something I'm deeply interested in. So I'm very happy to leave the Appalachian Mountains for a little time. So what I want to talk about, I want to discuss two things at this point. And obviously, we'll talk about the legacy later on, but some things that I think are important to mention so that we understand Churchill's frame of mind going into this. And the first is essentially Churchill's sort of past and his experiences that led him to the Cairo conference. And I think it's important to mention, a lot of the historiography until recently had always assumed that the British didn't really know or care that much about what was going on in the Middle East, that this was a sort of an afterthought and they just had to shut this down as quickly as they could and move on. And of course, this isn't necessarily true about Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill had served on the northwest frontier in India, fighting Islamic extremists. He had also served in Egypt and in the Sudan in what he called the River War in his book. And in this experience, he gained his own views about the Islamic world and about the Middle East. And it's also important to mention, of course, that his views are tempered by a couple things. The first is that his view of the Ottoman Empire, which is hugely important here, is sort of draped in a kind of, I'm going to say, a Tory worldview in the 19th century, which is to say that the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire, was a very important bulwark against the Russian Empire. Well, in 1921, as we could see, the Russian Empire was undergoing a significant change in turning into a Bolshevik state and undergoing a revolution, and Churchill feared this. So he was worried, of course, about a vacuum. The other thing to speak about here is, of course, Churchill's views of Islam itself. Now, a lot of people have looked at Churchill's often quoted thing from the River War, from the first edition of the River War, about his views of Islam. And he's very sort of damning in his remarks of Islam in that, which, of course, he immediately changed the next year. But if anyone's read my book, you can look and see, according to my research, that he's talking about a very specific type of Islam that was practiced by the dervishes in Egypt at the time, in my opinion. And so, because of course he served with Muslims in India, and he never made any kind of remarks like he had made about the sort of dervish Islam that was practiced, which was far outside the kind of traditional view of Islam. There's also, of course, the point that he, in the years from when he was a soldier through to the First World War, he had developed a very significant friendship with a man named Wilfred Scowen Blunt. Wilfred Scowen Blunt was probably one of the world's leading Arabists at the time. You might think of him as a sort of mentor even to T.E. Lawrence and Gertrude Bell, both of whom had read Blunt's own work, and he was heavily influenced by Blunt's thinking. Now, Blunt wrote a book called The Future of Islam in the 1880s, which prescribed an idea that once the Ottoman Empire had collapsed, that Britain should be the guarantor of a new Arab caliphate, and that there should be independent states that were sort of in orbit of the British Empire who guaranteed the whole thing. As you can see, these types of thinkings heavily influenced Churchill's imagination for how things could be structured. Now, if we move through the First World War and Churchill's own, interest in initially, in my opinion, trying to preserve the Ottoman Empire, swiftly moving away from that idea to trying to order and create this kind of Arab controlled Middle East, he had several objectives, and I want to discuss that next. That's what I'm going to focus on. Now, the first thing was to provide order, and I'm even not going to talk about the Middle East for a second, but the fact that the way the British had handled the Middle East prior to the First World War was a complete shambolic mess. You had different countries being handled by the Colonial Office, the Foreign Office, the India Office, the government of India, and all this created this sort of chaotic nature by which you could have three treaties that were also sort of diametrically opposed to one another. And of course, I don't want to step on what Alan has already said about those, so we'll steer clear of that. So in the first instance, Churchill, and it was actually Lloyd George had wanted Milner, who is at the Colonial Office, to handle this, but he refused to. So he gave it to Churchill, knowing that Churchill would push through using his sort of first force of personality. So this is where we get the Middle East office from, was Churchill trying to figure out a way to manage this. And of course, he brought in T.E. Lawrence and others to seek their counsel, Sir Percy Cox, Richard Meinhertshagen, and other experts to try to create an order here. And what he was ultimately pushing was this, as Alan mentioned, the Sharifian Solution, which was, of course, you would have King Hussein in Mecca, right, who would then sort of be at the center, and then you would have his sons, Faisal in Iraq, and then you would have his other son, Abdullah, in Jordan. And Palestine was a bit of a mixed bag because it was sort of controlled by the British Empire, and its mandate was more complex because of Jerusalem. Churchill believed that this would work for a couple reasons, and he sort of overlooked some of the major issues around it as well. And one of the things, of course, he overlooked was that Iraq was a predominantly Shia country, and he was putting a Sunni leader on top of it. Now, there's a real interesting thing that has, again, been in the historiography that said, well, Churchill wasn't that interested in this kind of stuff because he had to call up people at the India office and have it explained to him the difference between Shia and Sunni. But, and I've often remarked about this to people before, that at least he had the presence of mind to ask, because as we saw after Bush's invasion of Iraq, that there were some issues around these kind of problems that crept up again. So at least Churchill had the presence of mind to imagine that there could be issues here. Another reason he liked the Sharifian solution was that it would allow him to put pressure on different family members. For instance, if Faisal didn't do what the British wanted him to do, he could always call up Abdullah and say, hey, you have to help pressure me here. And he could hold them in sort of a triangular hole that would help, apply pressure as they needed to. This is one of the things that really appealed to Churchill and why he thought that this would be useful. And this is, of course, again, based on these of ideas that came from T.E. Lawrence as well as Wilfred Blunt. Now, the whole point for Churchill in doing this, I think, was to create a very strong British presence in the Middle East to help establish or act as a bulwark from whatever Russian or Bolshevik intrigues might be going on. And you can see this in his support initially for Kurdistan and eventually his backing off for the development of Kurdistan because he was afraid of upsetting Turkey and what that might mean more broadly in the Islamic world. And we can talk about that in questions later on. And the sort of third point, I think, that is important to remember here, and I'll come to a close shortly after this, is that for Churchill, he understood that after the First World War, being the Minister of Munitions, that all this had to be done extremely cheaply. And this was a huge point for him. And this is what historians have often focused on, leaving aside all of his cultural interest in the Middle East and Islam and all these sorts of things. They focused on him trying to do this economically. And his reliance on this sort of economical view, trying to control vast swathes of the desert and so forth, led to a policy of what is called, and this was established at the Cairo conference, colonial air policing, based on a sort of almost Benthamite panopticon ideas, whereby if someone on the ground saw someone in the airplane, the people on the ground would assume the person in the airplane is looking at them. And Churchill wrote about all these things. But of course, that created a detrimental and hugely problematic issue as it relates to what was accomplished at the Cairo conference. And finally, I think it's important to mention, I mentioned Palestine earlier. For Churchill, he had always imagined in Palestine both the Arabs and the Jews working together and creating a sort of, a national home for the Jewish people, as well as Palestine being its own sort of state and the national state, or, the national home being inside that state initially. Now, these things changed, of course, over time, so that by 1922, Churchill sort of worded things quite oddly, and he referred to Jewish immigration into Palestine up to its economic absorptive capacity, which was his phrase, but he never defined what that was. So that creates some of the sort of challenging legacy around this. That's not to mention some of the other really challenging legacies around Iraq, as we've seen, as well as Kurdistan. So you can see, I think, from this what Churchill's aims were, but just how precarious pulling this all together eventually became. And so I think that probably is that's the quickest I've ever done this. I hope that's okay.
Warren, that was more than okay. That was a fantastic introduction to Churchill and his perspective. But we're now going to turn to Dr. Leora Lukic. Leora is the author of 2 books on Gertrude Bell. The first, called A Quest in the Middle East, Gertrude Bell and the Making of Modern Iraq, which was published in 2006. And more recently, her book, Certainties and Uncertainties in Gertrude Bell's Many Lives. So Leora, Gertrude Bell is an amazing figure, a prominent and independent woman in the man's world. Can you now introduce her to our audience and talk a little bit perhaps about her aspirations for Iraq and what brings her to the Cairo conference? Leora. So Leora, I think you need to unmute and...
Okay. And
there we go. Yeah. There you are. You're on screen. Fantastic.
I'm on screen. Great. So let me start by saying that before the outbreak of World War I, Britain's interest in the Persian Gulf focused on the protection of India, the security of the oil refineries inhabitant, and the safety of the sea routes to the Far East, Australia, and other parts of the globe. The strategic importance of the Persian Gulf expanded then to the Middle East, as also France and Germany started focusing in the area. It is against this background that Gertrude Bell's appearance on the Middle Eastern stage should be understood. Not just driven by the excitement of discovery, Bell's travels differed from those of other women travelers mainly because of the amount of knowledge she was equipped with at the outset of her journey and her fluency in local languages, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, that allowed for a direct communication with the population. A daughter of the empire, she was also able to see the 40 lines of Britain's policies in the region and was quite ahead of her time in her judgment of men and situations. Nonetheless, she has to be understood from the perspective of her time, and her time was empire. Having experienced the Middle East as an explorer and as an author of travel books that became classics, Bell was seen by her critics as an imperialist in disguise. But she gradually changed her view as she became part of the process that led to the rebuilding of the Middle East after the war. She was exceptional in all her endeavors, courageous in her exploratory journey, competent in archaeology and history, an exquisite writer, and an insightful analyst. She described a moment in the Middle East that would shape a century politically, culturally, and historically. It was a moment when Ottomanism gave way to Arabism, when the spoils of the Ottoman Empire were partitioned at San Remo in 1920, and Britain was accorded a mandate over Iraq and Palestine, while France would have control over Syria and Lebanon. Gertrude Bell became part of the process, and yet she defended the Arab cause in two main conferences that decided the future of the region: the Peace Conference in 1919 and the Cairo Conference in 1921. Even if her policies remained controversial, she is still remembered in Iraq today as the enabler of a process that led to the creation of modern Iraq, a country that was beautifully described in her letters and thoroughly analyzed in her reports and memoranda. In her words, Bell's official papers depict the policies adopted by the British during Iraq's formative years. Although a leading member of the British administration, Bell understood Iraq also from the population's perspective. And this is why she, more than any other of her colleagues, is still remembered by Iraqis with admiration. She won their respect for her tenacity, knowledge, insightfulness, and personality. A child of fortune, her family owned one of the largest iron smelting enterprises in Europe, and her father was the director of the steel works at Middlesbrough. The Bell's fortune allowed for a life of travel and study. From Oxford to the Middle East, India, and China, Gertrude Bell's life story still inspires writers and readers. It was at Oxford that she met David Hogarth, the keeper of the Ashmolean Museum, who influenced her in her archaeological endeavors, and then, as the war broke out, invited her to Cairo, where a new intelligence unit, the Arab Bureau, was in charge of following the Turks and the Germans in their activities in the region. In 1916, she proceeded from Cairo to Basra at the request of India's Viceroy, Lord Hardinge, to check on the administration of the former Ottoman province since the landing of the British troops there on November 1914, 3 months after the outbreak of the war. She was then attached to the British force as assistant to Sir Percy Cox, the chief political officer, and wrote official reports and articles for the Arab Bulletin that remained classified after the war, given the importance of the information therein contained. Following the conquest of Baghdad in March 1917, she joined the administration and worked under Colonel A.T. Wilson, the acting civil commissioner from 1918 to 1920, as Sir Percy Cox was sent to Tehran to negotiate the terms of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. In her clashes with Wilson on the importance of Iraq's political emancipation, that also implied a local government under an Arab ruler, Bell was the first to support the idea of Iraq's independence, considering also a matter of Britain's interest. Wilson's tough policies and the decision at San Remo to create mandates in the Middle East led to rebellion. In view of the heavy costs of the 1920 rebellion in Iraq, it was decided to end the unpopular mandate, bring Sir Percy Cox back to Baghdad as High Commissioner, and create a provisional council led by the Naqib of Baghdad, Abdel Rahman al-Kailani, the most important Sunni religious authority. Gertrude Bell had maintained very friendly relations with the Naqib from the time of her visits to Baghdad before the war, and was influential in his acceptance of the post of President of the Council. Officially reappointed as Sir Percy Cox Oriental Secretary, she helped shape Iraq's institutions and Britain's post-war policies in the region as a whole. As such, she understood the moment from within and the controversies underlying it. In view of the divergent agendas, it was decided to create a new department to deal with Middle Eastern affairs, and Bell was asked to delineate its parameters and functions. In a memorandum found in Bell's archive at the University of Newcastle, she delineated the department's scope, aims, and staff of officials from the Foreign Office and the India Office that would centralize Britain's policies in the region. Churchill, newly appointed as Secretary of State of the Colonies, decided then to convene the conference in Cairo to deal with most urgent issues, political and financial, that preoccupied the British government at the end of the war. Leading experts in the Middle East were then invited to Cairo to find more creative solutions to the conflicting promises made to the French, the Arabs, and the Jews during the war, namely the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence, and the Balfour Declarations. The 40 Thieves, as Churchill named the officials and officers attending the conference, included Sir Percy Cox, Cornwallis, the former director of the Arab Bureau, T. Lawrence of Arabia, now Churchill personal advisor, Gertrude Bell, Sassoon Haskell, Iraq's Minister of Finances, and Sir Hugh Trenchard, Chief of the Air Staff, that suggested the adoption of an air defense scheme consisting of a network of air bases to maintain security without relying on British troops. An important scheme given Britain's post-war financial difficulties. Among the decisions taken officially in Cairo, in fact, most of them had been made in private conversations between Churchill and Lawrence, were also those based on Percy Cox and Gertrude Bell's recommendations. Among them, the establishment of Iraq as a kingdom and the endorsement of Emir Faisal, the son of Hussein, the Sheriff of Mecca, and the military leader of the Arab Revolt against the Ottomans, as future king of Iraq. Emir Faisal, who had been expelled from Syria by the French, was considered the best choice for Iraq's throne. A descendant of Imam Ali, the cousin of the Prophet and of Muhammad's daughter Fatima, Faisal would be more easily accepted by the Shia population in Iraq than any other candidate. Moreover, his good relations with British officers Lawrence and Cornwallis and his understanding of Britain's and France's power in the region put him ahead of the Naqib, that was already serving as the President of the Provisional Council in Baghdad, formed by Sir Percy Cox after the rebellion. Faisal also had the support of the Sharifians, former officers in the Ottoman army that had joined him in the Arab Revolt and in the conquest of Damascus, many of them of Iraqi origin. Faisal's nomination was still depending on Emir Abdallah's consent to step aside, though, as he had been designated by their father, Sharif Hussein, as Iraq's next leader. The problem was solved by creating a new territory, Transjordan, and separate its administration from Palestine's. That would turn, so the British believed, Abdallah's focus from control over the entire area of the mandate and from his dreams to unite Transjordan with Iraq and even Syria. As the whole conference moved to Jerusalem to meet the Emir, Bell's presence was quite relevant, even if her ideas regarding the establishment of a national home for Jewish people in Palestine diverged from Churchill's and Lawrence's views. In effect, Churchill recognized the importance of a national home for the Jews in parts of historic Palestine and conveyed his views to the Palestinian delegations that came to see him, namely, that the Balfour Declaration was an accomplished fact and that the appointment of Herbert Samuel as High Commissioner for Palestine was made on the basis of his credentials and not of his Jewish background. Gertrude Bell held the route to Baghdad was now open for Faisal and his followers. And Gertrude Bell helped Faisal in his new role at each step, from his arrival in Basra on June 21 to his reception by the communities, his touring of the provinces, the winning of the tribe's allegiance, and his coronation on August 23, 1921. As well explained by Ali Alawi in his most comprehensive biography of Iraq's first king, Faisal was aware of the divisions and conflicts, sectarian, tribal, and regional he would face. And yet he was convinced of the value of his role as a unifying figure that would project Iraq's national ideas into the future. Bell also saw Faisal as an Arab leader, a common denominator who would bridge between Sunni Shias and Kurds and play a unique role in the history of Iraq and of the region as a whole. And yet, she warned him of the possible obstacles in the reorganization of Iraq's administration by relying mainly on his followers, even if having in mind the Shias' political rights and the Kurds' desire for autonomy. But it was a process that took time, and the need of inclusion was also interspersed with an increasing opposition to the British presence from the population. The way each faction reacted and how the opposition contributed to the forging of an Iraqi modern national identity remains to be studied. But Faisal, who was not prepared to accept the mandate and wanted a renegotiation of its terms, took the lead, navigating among the issues of contest that were not accepted by the nationalists. Bell understood then that she and Faisal followed parallel roads leading to a main aim, Iraq's independence. Nationalist parties were now part of the process, a process that would take time and effort, and whose results would be questions in the decades that come. For this very reason, Bell was well aware of the need to insert Iraq's historical legacies and heritage in the process. This is why she returned to archaeology and started the creation of Iraq's first national museum once her role in the administration ended. So who was Gertrude Bell? How can we define her and sum up her contribution? She was a daughter of a liberal imperialist who instilled her with self-confidence to compete in a men's world and play a role in the front page of history. Very opinionated. She created different levels of impact while keeping different strengths together. All these by also considering the short-time implications and the broader consequences. In sum, she was a daughter of the empire at the outset of the journey and an Iraqi nationalist at the end of her life. This is why her life story points out more ways to reconstruct the present West-East dialogue. Thank you.
Leora, thank you very, very much for that. So we're now going to turn to our third protagonist, and we're going to move from a daughter of the empire and an Iraqi nationalist to very much a son of the empire and a supporter of the Hashemites and the Arab cause. And that is, of course, T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, whose participation in the Arab Revolt during the First World War had earned him celebrity status by 1921. And I'm delighted that we have with us Dr. Rob Johnson from Oxford University, author of the recently published Lawrence of Arabia on War, and an expert on British policy in the Middle East during this period. So Rob, can you introduce Lawrence to us and tell us about his key role in shaping the results of this conference?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm just going to try and, I was going to try and click something, but it hasn't worked. So I'm going to carry on regardless. Well, first of all, let me say Shalom and salam and good day to all of you, and my thanks to the Society and all our sponsors for the opportunity to just chat to you. Lawrence, of course, is a very enigmatic figure and extremely hard to pin down. But when we talk about his aspirations, we should start with the fact that he was, as you've just said, Alan, somebody with a great deal of affection and interest in the Arabs as a people, but particularly in the Hashemites in particular. He had accompanied, guided, and sometimes led the Arab Northern Army under Emir Faisal during the First World War. And fundamentally, he wanted to assert by right of conquest Arab control of Syria and Arabia Felix, the Greater Arabia. In 1919, he accompanied an Arab delegation and was permitted to attend the Paris Peace Conference, which of course the French tried to prevent. They didn't want him to come with an Arab delegation, but he was acting on behalf of the UK's Foreign Office. And his aspiration was the same in 1919, to obtain Arab states that would reward the Hashemites, or Hashimi, as they're known locally, for their war efforts. And he produced a map, a very famous map, of his proposal for an independent Arabia. There were to be, in his conception, separate emirates. Abdullah, for example, was initially to be given Iraq rather than Faisal. Faisal would be given Syria. Zaid would acquire northern Arabia, and Hussein would remain the king of the Hejaz. But there were three fundamental problems and challenges right before we get to Cairo. First was, as we know, France sought to render Syria little more than a colony, and Palestine too, by the way. This was the initiative of the Comité d'Asie, and what France wanted in order to get its way was to force the British into an agreement where they would get this colony, and to do so, they said they would make it conditional on the alliance that was signed on the 28th of June, 1919, of course, the same day as the Treaty of Versailles was actually signed. And this was crucial for Britain because it was part of their future defense and security in Europe and the rest of the world. Lawrence's solutions, therefore, for these separate emirates were rejected as part of the Paris Peace Conference. And Lawrence himself, his ideas were repudiated, in part because he became a very strong critic later on of the revolt in Iraq, which we've just been hearing about. The second problem and challenge was that Britain, and indeed Lawrence himself, were concerned that these nascent Arab states that he had in mind would be overwhelmed by either by Turkish nationalists or by the new force in the world, the Bolsheviks, and that the Arabs, unless they were protected by Britain, would not be able to stand up for themselves in these early days. The other thing to bear in mind, the third and final problem before Cairo, was that Britain was committed, and Lawrence knew it, to existing Arab partners, not just the Hashemites. So in Oman, in the Hadramaut, the Trucial states, Kuwait, Ibn Saud at Riyadh, all of these were Britain's partners, and all of them, all their interests, had to be considered. The problem was that the Arabs themselves were deeply divided over what the future form of the Middle East should take. So while Mesopotamia had potential to develop its resources, and by the way, in these early days, it wasn't oil, it was actually rather grain, that was thought to be the kind of maybe the center of gravity, potentially, of the Middle East. So when Lawrence approaches this idea of a conference at Cairo to fundamentally address the territorial and political situation that had arisen in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, as Warren was talking about earlier, Lawrence got to work before the conference with Winston Churchill in his role, his forthcoming role as Colonial Secretary. But of course, peacemaking is always challenging, and in such a complex environment, it was particularly so in 1919 through to 1921. Now, if we jump ahead about his aspirations, what we can say is that Lawrence concludes his time with Cairo by saying, we have concluded the Arab business with clean hands. And this was a very controversial remark for many people after the event. People have questioned, what did he mean, clean hands, when so much goes wrong after the event? Well, it was on three terms. First, that with the exception of Syria, he felt that Britain had given the Arab leaders either autonomy or full independence with British assistance. In Palestine, he argued that the federation concept of bringing together two different communities of Jews and Arabs appeared, despite minor unrest, to be working, largely thanks to the conciliatory work of Herbert Samuel, who we've just been hearing about. And the third grounds was that Lawrence felt that the interests of all sides had been satisfied at Cairo in 1921. But of course, three criticisms remained, and he was very aware of those. Firstly, Syria was not independent, but Lawrence felt that Faisal did get the more significant state of Iraq. He felt, as I say, that the center of gravity of the Middle East was shifting. Syria wasn't as valuable as he thought it was during the war, but Iraq was going to be the future for a greater Arabia. The second criticism that he was deeply aware of was the idea of the Jewish homeland. He felt it would prove incompatible with Palestinians, and I think broadly most people felt that that was the case thereafter. Thirdly, he felt that Arabs continued to be divided, and full independence was taking far longer than local people had hoped for. And we should just recall at this point that this wasn't just disagreement or division amongst, say, Sunni and Shia. We must include in this calculation the fact that there was a war going on between the Saudis and the Hashemites, particularly 1924-25, which resulted in the Saudis taking over the Hejaz, and Hussein fled to Jordan. Now, when it comes to a conclusion about what did Lawrence really think could be achieved at Cairo, though, you have to ask, first of all, the question, which Lawrence are we talking about? Because those of you who know the story of T. Lawrence will know that the young Lawrence, the romantic, the optimist, by the 1920s had become deeply suspicious of colonial designs. By 1926, we can talk about a very disillusioned Lawrence, who's probably suffering from the traumas that he experienced during the war. And the late Lawrence, of course, became very reflective and much more reclusive. But the 1920s Lawrence that we're talking about wanted what he described as brown dominions aligned to the British Empire, self-governing, equal populations within the British Empire, something of the nature of a commonwealth, free association, sharing the same sorts of values. Anachronistic perhaps to us today, but very much the view that Lawrence took at the time. He felt very strongly indeed that France should set up an independent Syria, but as I say, he changed his mind about Syria's importance. He saw Baghdad as this really critical fulcrum of the Middle East. And it's for that reason that he encouraged Faisal to come out of exile in London as the candidate to lead Iraq. And he promoted Abdullah as leader to the region beyond the Jordan. He wanted Zaid still to rule in the north of Arabia and Hussein in Hejaz. But he also acknowledged that Saud would rule in the southeast of Arabia with all the other rulers confirmed in place, with Britain acting as a security guarantor of the future. Lawrence certainly agreed with Winston Churchill there should be a Middle Eastern Department of Specialists to ensure support, ongoing support for Arab leaders through the 1920s and beyond, not just, therefore, the Foreign Office, the India Office and the Colonial Office, but real specialists, just as we've been hearing, all of whom would be modelled on this group that had been formed up in the war with the Arab Bureau. But Lawrence and Churchill were to be frustrated by, particularly by Emir Hussein's or Sharif Hussein's refusal to compromise pretty much on anything after the war was over. What they both wanted, I think, was, above all else, was a desire to see the region at peace, developed, and reaching self-government. And both Lawrence and Churchill shared the idea that they put their faith in the Hashemite family, Hashemite dynasty, to do so, as Churchill told the House of Commons in June of 1921. But what we got, of course, was something quite different. We've already heard about the Iraq Revolt in 1920. Lawrence felt particularly the reason why that had happened was that there were too few Arab officials and leaders genuinely reading what was going on in Iraq, that he felt very strongly the region could not be held by force, and he was deeply prejudiced against the Indian colonial model he felt was being set up. He felt that a minimal presence was preferable, as we've been hearing, led by the RAF and a political advisor. He had a vision. It was quite practical for the time, but it was based very much on a moment in time. Lawrence, in the end, at the end of that year in 1921, simply could not persuade Hussein, the leader of the Hashemite dynasty, to accept any final agreement over Arabia in 1921. And it was for that reason that Britain could no longer go on supporting Hussein. And this is why, of course, Hussein in the Hejaz was defeated by the Saudis in 1924. But I think the final thing to say about this is that all of these entities that were created did eventually reach their independence. And I think one thing we have to bear in mind is a point made by Lawrence himself, is that the Arabs in this story had their own agency. It just wasn't a set of designs thought up by the British alone. This was something in which the Arabs shaped their own destiny. And if you want to know more of that, there is a wonderful exhibition on at the moment, which you'll be able to visit at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which I'm deeply associated, an exhibition dedicated to this period of Arabian history.
Rob, thank you very much. It's clear from what you've said and what's been said before you by Warren and Leora that the results of the conference were heavily shaped by the thinking of Churchill, Lawrence and Bell. And I'm very conscious that we've been looking at things through the sort of the British lens, through British perspectives. And as you've just said, the Arabs did have their own agency in this, as did the other peoples in the region. So I want now to widen out and to look at those on the receiving end of Churchill's solution. And I want to bring in Professor Ari Dubnov, who is the Max Ticktin Chair of Israel Studies at George Washington University. His current book and research project is tentatively entitled Dreamers of the Third Empire / Temple, and examines ties between Zionist and British imperial thinkers in the interwar years, and looks to uncover alternative, neglected federalist political schemes for the future of the region that were circulating at the time. But Ari, what I think we're looking for to you to do this afternoon is to give us something on the Jewish perspective on this conference and on these events.
Right. Well, first and foremost, thank you, Alan, for orchestrating this. Thank you to the Churchill Society for hosting this event. When we approached the question of the Cairo conference, I was just chatting about it with a colleague in Israel who's studying the mandatory period, the interwar period, and the British presence in Palestine. And he focuses primarily on the history of sports and especially football, as it should properly be called, not soccer, as in the country in which I reside at the moment. He told me, the Cairo conference was a cause of an enormous disappointment. I was put aback and asked why. And he told me, people were waiting eagerly for Churchill and Herbert Samuel to come as the VIP guests for a football match between the army team and the local Jewish team when they opened a new sports club in the German colony in Jerusalem. And because things were dragged at the Cairo, they came too late, and the audience had to face a very dry and long speech by the charismatic Ronald Storrs, the military governor of Jerusalem. And I'm starting with this vignette because I think in a way it tells you something about the special relationship that emerged between the Zionist movement and the British Empire at this very initial formative stage. So perhaps my, so to speak, protagonists are less eccentric and opinionated and colorful figures, especially when compared to Lawrence of Arabia and Gertrude Bell, but they play a not less important role, and questions of agency are indeed very interesting here. To what degree the British colonial architects are calling the shots, and to what degree the locals do have some autonomy. But I would like to first and foremost remind us that from a Zionist perspective, what is important to understand is that World War I was a big game changer in terms of a movement that was very close to its dead end before the war broke out. The war brings to the forefront new type of leaders. One can think about the career of someone like Vladimir Jabotinsky, who co-founded the Zion Mule Corps, this small unit that joined the landing in Gallipoli, and then the much more impressive, bigger Jewish Legion that fought side by side within the British Army, composed of Jewish volunteers who joined the army. And especially, of course, the charismatic Chaim Weizmann that is credited to be sort of the master chef behind the Balfour Declaration. I would also want to remind us all that our perception of the Balfour Declaration today, 100 plus years after the effect, tends to look at it as a very clear blueprint of national sovereignty or independence, while at the time, this was a document that was extremely vague in its phrasing and purposely so. The famous lines that His Majesty's government looks in a favorable eye at the creation of a national home in Palestine is often quoted. But if we unpack this phrasing, we can see how much careful diplomatic architecture worked its way into this famous declaration by the British saying that they're only looking in favor. They're not necessarily saying that they are actively the ones that need to pursue the creation of a national home. The use of a term national home, not colony, not state, not protectorate, but something which is very amorphous, very ambiguous, that is open to interpretation, is one of the big achievements of that document. And even the fact that it's a national home in Palestine. It's not a national home that would cover the entire borders of Palestine that are still unclear. So it's not clear what is the size and the shape of this national home. Is it a small settlement that you could simply call it a national home? Would that suffice? Yes or no? And I mention it because part of what is happening in the context, which it provides the context to the Cairo conference, is the fact that the Zionists in general and Chaim Weizmann in particular need to flash out and create and turn the Balfour Declaration into an instrument and something that has muscle and power within that context. What is also, of course, very important to remember about the aftermath of World War I is that Britain becomes a Mediterranean power. Now it controls the entire Mediterranean Sea from Gibraltar to Haifa, especially when the deep sea port in Haifa would be established. And at the same time, we tend to forget, especially when we think about the Great War or World War I from a European Western perspective. We have the images of the Western Front, the trench warfare. We tend to forget that in the East, in the Near East and the Middle East, the war did not exactly end on November 11, 1918. Numerous crises are still taking place. So we have to understand that the conference is taking place in this period that some people refer to as years of plasticity. The mandate settlement was not yet established and formed. The League of Nations is just making its first steps, and it's not, the mandate on Palestine was not yet declared. And so part of what we see here is a stage leading to the creation of the mandate in Palestine that is recognized by an international authority in Geneva, namely the League, to which the Balfour Declaration will be built into, but this is exactly happening at the eve of that moment. So this is an important kind of a transitional phase in terms of at least how we would probably position it within the context of Zionist historiography. So we of course know very well that part of what led Churchill and others to convene the conference in Cairo has to do with the concerns to resolve those conflicting policies defined by the McMahon letters and the Balfour Declaration. And of course, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. I would like also to remind our audience that the Sykes-Picot was supposed to be, of course, a secret agreement. It comes to the light and grabs the attention thanks to the fact that when the Russians are removed from the equation, as you reminded us, of course, the Soviets are happy to show the document that provides the proof that, according to them and the Leninist propaganda, of course, World War I was all about imperial shadow diplomacy, and that's almost kind of the best proof they can have. So all these agreements are coming out and are exposed, sort of to speak, in the same point. I'm not necessarily sure that the plan was that the Sykes-Picot would be known to the broader audience. Part of what is happening in these years is also that the attempts to do politics without the British are very limited. It doesn't mean that they do not exist. For instance, we are familiar with the Faisal-Weizmann Agreement of January 1919. That was the agreement between the Emir Faisal, the third son of Hussein ibn Ali al-Hashimi, the king of the short-lived kingdom of Hijaz. And even in that agreement, you can see that the main parties agreed that they would carry the effects of the Balfour Declaration. So they call for a Jewish national home in Palestine. Again, what are the borders of Palestine are still up to grabs. The Muslim holy places were to remain under Muslim control. The boundaries between this Arab state and Palestine should be determined later on by a commission after the Paris Peace Conference. So you do have some of these attempts to do local politics, so to speak. But many would argue that other attempts are crushed very quickly. For instance, Elizabeth Thompson's recent book that goes back and traces back the Syrian Congress of March 1920 that declares independence of Greater Syria shows how the local actors that truly believe that they follow the script of President Wilson 14 points very quickly understands that there's a very limited maneuvering space for them in that respect. So that leads me perhaps to the key point, which focuses perhaps on Chaim Weizmann, the key actor in that new arena, that he needs that understands very quickly that he needs to work with the British, alongside the British, exactly in order to turn this letter that Lord Balfour sent to Lord Rothschild into that instrument that we call the Balfour Declaration. And Chaim Weizmann is a fantastic and a fascinating figure. A recent masterful biography, a new biography of him, came out in Hebrew just this year by Yuda Reinhardt and Moti Golani, which I hope will be translated soon into English. But the important thing that I would like to remind us all, Weizmann was notoriously known as pro-British, sometimes is described as an Anglophile. There's something a bit odd about these descriptions because Weizmann himself was a British citizen, a very patriotic British citizen that helped the British war effort during World War I. As a scientist, his scientific achievements were central to in the background of that type of interesting special relationship. And this is part of what allows him to gain that influence in the quarters of power in Britain, knowing that while he has a small headquarters in Palestine, especially in his beautiful villa in Rehovot, where the Weizmann Institute of Science resides today, his real headquarters still reside in the heart of London, 77 Great Russell Street, just a block away from the British Library. And he knows that this is where the big decisions will be made. And this is in a way much of his advantage has to do with that understanding that the nerve system is still London. I think that this is a very important point to remind many of us, especially in the light of the recent scholarship that really shows brilliantly the way in which the post-World War years are also the beginning of a new international era. And part of what makes the 1920s and 30s so challenging, fascinating, but so difficult to grasp is the fact that they are in a way neither nor. They're neither the old colonial way of doing politics, nor do they represent what we will see after World War II in the form of a fast imperial breakdown and decolonization leading to the creation of independent nation states, often through very violent struggles of independence. And this in-betweeners, in-betwixt status has to do with what my predecessor Rob just mentioned, this very interesting conception of federation and a vision of the empire as a commonwealth of nations in which the local populations have a greater degree of autonomy, short of full-fledged nation statehood sovereignty divorced from the empire. And I think that this is the assumption that so many mainstream Zionists are working with during the 1920s, and especially when you see figures like Sir Herbert Samuel, an Anglo-Jew who is sympathetic of Zionism, that will be the first High Commissioner of Palestine and a central bridge figure. This is part of the working assumption. I will finish my short remarks with asking, of course, where Churchill comes into the picture here. And we will not be able to open the big debate, if not the Pandora box, about Churchill and the Jews, which is a source of enormous debate among historians. I would like to mention the fact that, of course, Churchill is not the same person his entire career, and he changes his views and opinions. And Churchill of the Cairo Conference is a figure that has a very particular view of Zionism. Perhaps the best popular expression of that opinion has to do with his famous, some would argue infamous, article on Zionism versus Bolshevism, in which his anxiety, concern, fear from communism, and almost anti-Semitic association of Jews with communism, in a way, is translated into a very strong endorsement of Zionism, to the degree that a vulgar reading of that article will say that Churchill is looking at the Jews and is saying, if we want to push them towards Zionism that can be worked alongside the British interest and turn the Zionists into productive Jews that at the same time will protect British interest east of Suez, they will come the Trotskys and the Trotskyites and the Bolsheviks that are toppling down regimes and bring upon the menace of Bolshevism. This is the type of support and endorsement of Zionism that you see in Churchill of the 1920s. After World War II, the situation would change very fast and very radically. The ideas about creation of proxy national movement that enjoys an autonomy or self-governance under the auspices of the Commonwealth and works alongside with it is challenged from all sides in the so-called Palestine triangular of British, Jews, and Palestinians. And of course, Churchill himself famously is questioning his own belief, especially after the assassination of his good friend, Lord Moyne, whose photo we saw earlier this afternoon in November 6, 1944, by the right-wing Zionist underground movement. So many of the working assumptions that were built during the early 1920s and the Cairo Conference are actually scrutinized and challenged after World War II, and the onset of a very different type of Zionism, often the one that actually shapes our memory and our visions when we're thinking in popular memory about the British in Palestine and the breakdown of the mandatory system and the creation of Israel-Palestine and the war. Thank you.
Okay, Ari, thank you very much. And thank you to all our speakers for introducing the sort of the complexity and the nuance of this time and the issues that were being considered at the Cairo conference. You've certainly given us an enormous amount to digest. I'm conscious of time. We are running slightly over. I want to give our audience a quick moment to have a sort of 2-minute comfort break. And then when we return, we're going to hear a presentation from Ian Kikuchi about his research for an exhibition on Churchill and the Middle East, which is at the Imperial War Museum, or actually at the Churchill War Rooms in London. And we will then have time for a discussion of the Cairo conference and its legacy. And I'm thrilled to see that there are plenty of questions coming in. So I'm hoping that we'll get to plenty of those. So we're going to have a 2-minute break. During the break, we're going to show 30 artworks from the Imperial War Museum collection by the Scottish artist James McBay. And James McBay was an official artist active in the Sinai Palestine campaign, and his works give a striking sense of the region 100 years ago. And the selection that Ian has kindly chosen for us includes locations in Egypt, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, all done in 1917 to 18. So my thanks to Ian and the IWM for us allowing us to show these, and we'll resume in a couple of minutes' time. Thank you. Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. I'm getting a message on my screen saying that I can't start my video because the host has stopped it. So if Justin, if you can just release my video. Okay, thanks very much. Okay, well, welcome back. I hope you had a chance to have a quick break or boil a kettle or do whatever you need to do. We've still got a lot to get through, and I'm delighted now to introduce Ian Kikuchi. Ian is Senior Curator and Historian at the Imperial War Museums in the UK, and he led the research for the exhibition Churchill and the Middle East, which launched at the Churchill War Rooms in 2017. And we thought this would be a wonderful opportunity, given that it's difficult to visit the museum at the moment, for Ian actually to show you some of the treasures of that display and to talk about the challenges he faced in curating it. Ian.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm just going to share this screen. So hopefully you can all see a red screen. I'm very pleased to be able to speak to you all. It's a pleasure to be here. My thanks to Alan for the invitation. As Alan says, I'm with the IWM. I've been there since 2006, and in the last 10 years or so, I've been an exhibition curator. Churchill in the Middle East is a small exhibition at the Churchill Museum, part of the Cabinet War Room's historic site, which has been run as a museum by IWM since 1984. As a project, Churchill in the Middle East was presented to me in late 2016. It was an opportunity to add something new to the visitor offer. To complement the Churchill Museum's chronological and biographical approach, it made sense for any addition to look at some discrete thematic subject. It was felt that the Middle East and Churchill's involvement in it offered a suitable subject for discussion. The first task was to read up on the subject and to begin to identify a narrative. In this, I was greatly assisted by Dr. Warren Doctor, also on this call, who wrote a treatment of the subject in broad terms and which helped me get my bearings. Warren's treatment was comprehensive, beginning with Churchill's early life and running throughout his lifetime. This is a view you can see of the Churchill Museum, and this is a plan showing the area available to the show. It's 21 square meters, which is somewhat larger than the average American car parking space, but not by much. There was clearly a need to cut the story down. Alongside the initial reading was to start an initial trawl of archives, collections, etc. for objects, documents, and media that might either inform my research or even be suitable for exhibition. At one point, I compiled a list of all of the attendees of the Cairo conference that you see here, located as many of their archives as I could, and looked to see what they were saying about each other, but sadly, space precluded displaying much of it. In due course, the narrative began to firm up, to begin with Churchill's period as Secretary of State for the Colonies in 1921 and his Cairo conference. For a while, I was enamored with the idea of devoting the entire exhibition discussion to the conference, going into the detail of the political and strategic questions, the personalities and backstories of the attendees, and telling the anecdotes that played out around the edges. Unfortunately, I think the focus on the conference approach seemed to beg the question, what happened next? Here then is the story in a nutshell. Churchill becomes Colonial Secretary. He must honour wartime promises while also serving Britain's strategic interests and cutting the cost of administering new territories. To do so, he installs client rulers in Iraq, Transjordan and Hejaz, paying off their rival Ibn Saud. He upholds the Balfour Declaration in the face of Palestinian Arab opposition, believing Zionism will be a good thing for Palestine and for the British Empire. In the 1930s, later in the 1930s, in his wilderness years, he visits the Middle East again as a tourist. One of his hosts is Frederick Peake, an attendee at his conference who reports the growing Arab opposition to Jewish immigration. Churchill maintains his support, however, later strongly criticising British policy and the 1939 White Paper, which restricted further Jewish immigration to Palestine. With the outbreak of war in 1939, the Middle East becomes a key theatre. Churchill oversees British strategy, continually urging a more aggressive attitude. 1941 sees interventions in Iraq, but also in the French colonies of Lebanon and Syria. Restrictions on Jewish immigration to Palestine remain in force, applied even to Jewish refugees escaping Nazi-occupied Europe. Sections of Palestinian Jewish opinion turn against Britain, and Churchill's friend Lord Moyne is assassinated. Seeking an ally, Churchill approaches Ibn Saud and reminds him of past support, asking him to broker an Arab compromise in Palestine. By this point, Churchill has little to offer and very little leverage. Ibn Saud brusquely refuses. Churchill leaves office in 1945 and becomes leader of the opposition. He criticises Labour policy in Palestine as the situation there deteriorates. In 1958, when told of the bloody overthrow of the Hashemite family in Iraq, Churchill remarks, "The Middle East is one of the hardest-hearted areas in the world. peace has only reigned when a major power has established firm influence. We end the story then at the end of Churchill's life with much, but not all, of Churchill's 1921 scheme having been overtaken by events. Now, this story is obviously not complete or comprehensive. I doubt that any story told in such a small space could be, and I throw myself on the mercy of the audience for their kindness and understanding. To try and avoid any howling errors, however, Warren Doctor and Professor Rob Johnson were kind enough to read and comment on the text from time to time. So then to the design process. Working with our designers, Cass and Mann, the firm who designed the Churchill Museum, we discussed the story, the objects we might exhibit, and the way the space can help tell that story. For a time, this exhibition was being referred to as Ian's Map and Flag Show. Given the small exhibition space, it was obvious that we couldn't tell all of the story through text panels, objects, and captions. Cass and Mann proposed using audiovisual techniques, specifically an animated film based on a map on which the story would be told. Accordingly, they designed a projection surface resembling an oversized map case. We were also interested, I think, as a sideline in some of Churchill's paintings of Middle Eastern scenes. Painting was one of Churchill's major pastimes, and some of his Middle Eastern paintings play out in the exhibition space as digital projections on an easel. These two you can see on the screen were executed during the Cairo conference. The one on the left is Cairo seen from the pyramids, and the one on the right is a view of Jerusalem. We were interested, I think, in the idea of Churchill not only redrawing maps, but in a region known for its ancient architecture, also painting new strategic and political landscapes. In all, the story is told through one 6.5-minute animated video, 11 documents, 4 flags, 3 photographs, 2 other objects, 2 pamphlets, 1 portrait, 1 poster, and 1 map. I haven't the time to say a great deal about every exhibit, but I must show you some. I think curators are those who enjoyed show and tell whilst at school, so please forgive me. Our story begins in London with a meeting between Churchill and Emir Faisal bin Hussein of the Hashemite family. This flag of the Arab Revolt flew over Faisal's house in Damascus after his occupation of the city in October 1918. 2 letters. In the letter on the left, Churchill writes to his wife Clementine, referring to the establishment of his new Middle Eastern department, the gratifying size and warmth of his new office, and he refers in the lower paragraph to his pleasure at having got T.E. Lawrence to put on a bridle and collar, he says, as his new advisor. The letter on the right is from Lawrence to Wilfred Blunt, who we heard Warren talk about earlier. Somewhat mischievously, Lawrence says to Blunt, "We start tomorrow for Cairo. I'll either get my way or resign, or even do both things." But he also comments favourably on Churchill's active mind and engagement with the questions of the Middle East. Following the conference, Churchill travels to Jerusalem. IWM collections include the surrender flag, a torn hospital bedsheet from the American colony commune in Jerusalem, carried by the mayor of Jerusalem when the city was surrendered in 1917. Those of you who know your Bible will immediately recognize the symbolism of this object, a German saw-backed bayonet beaten into a pruning hook, a sword into a plowshare. This was acquired by Herbert Samuel, the first Palestine High Commissioner, who we heard discussed earlier, and it was donated to IWM. Here is Samuel with Churchill at an ill-fated tree planting on the grounds of the Hebrew University. By the later 1920s, the later Lawrence that Rob Johnson referred to, Lawrence had finished his memoirs and he gifted a copy to Churchill. Lawrence inscribed them to Churchill, saying that he had made a happy ending to the show. Churchill revered Lawrence and his writing and highly valued this endorsement. Later in the early 1930s, Lawrence added a longer, even more fulsome inscription. He says, 11 years after we set our hands to making an honest settlement, all our work still stands, the countries having gone forward, our own interest having been saved, and nobody killed on our side or the other. To have planned for 11 years is statesmanship. I ought to have given you 2 copies of this work. We might detect a touch of conceit and self-praise in that from Lawrence. By the kindness of the Churchill family, we've been able to exhibit this book and its inscription. Churchill would repeatedly hark back to this endorsement, even when speaking in Parliament in 1946, shortly after the bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. The 1930s were Churchill's wilderness years. In 1934, he took a holiday with his friend Lord Moyne. Travelling in Moyne's yacht Resora, Churchill and Clementine toured the Mediterranean and Middle East. Lady Moyne later compiled a photo album, now in the National Portrait Gallery in London, which includes these images, including Churchill swimming in a pool on deck. In Jerusalem, they stayed a night at the King David Hotel. In Jericho, they met Frederick Peake, an attendee at the conference in 1921, seen here in the bottom left wearing the keffiyeh, and by that point, commander of the Transjordanian Arab Legion. In 1936, shortly before the outbreak of an Arab revolt in Palestine that year, Peake wrote to Churchill to urge him to support restrictions on Jewish immigration. War broke out in 1939. This is a close-up on the left-hand side of the car flag of General Wavell, Commander-in-Chief, Middle East. The telegram is from Churchill to Wavell in May 1941, ordering him to intervene in Iraq following a coup by Rashid Ali, while also warning him of a potential German fly-in to Syria and ordering him to split his air force 3 ways and urging him to run the kinds of risks that the Germans were accustomed to. If the lion on Wavell's car flag looks a bit worried, perhaps telegrams like this were part of the reason why. The same year, Lord Moyne's yacht Resora was mined and sunk off Tobruk. In this Vichy French poster, Churchill is an octopus with bloodied tentacles stretching across the Middle East. In 1942, with the Second Battle of El Alamein, the tide of the war changed in the Middle East. Here's Churchill visiting the front line in August, and also as a chess piece carved in later years by a veteran of the battle. Churchill, of course, is the White King. In 1945, following the assassination of Churchill's friend Lord Moyne, and in light of the deteriorating situation in Palestine, Churchill has an unproductive meeting with Ibn Saud, a man who at Cairo in 1921, following Cairo, or who at Cairo in 1921, Churchill had agreed to pay off. Ibn Saud completely rejects Churchill's demand that he broker a compromise in Palestine and immediately reports the conversation to Colonel William Eddy, the US Minister Resident and Intelligence Officer. Eddy reports Ibn Saud describing Churchill opening the subject confidently wielding the big stick. With his defeat in the 1945 election, Churchill enters opposition, where he criticises Labour policy towards Palestine. This is the flag of the last High Commissioner, General Alan Cunningham, and it flew from the Royal Navy cruiser that carried him out of Haifa when Britain gave up the mandate in May 1948. And here's a view of the completed exhibition. And you can see on the projection surface the quote about the Middle East being the hardest-hearted area in the world. One thought with which to close. Museum exhibitions, and especially broad historical narrative exhibitions, are very rarely definitive. They are highly contingent pieces of work, a product of a balancing act between the objects you exhibit, the space you have in which to exhibit them, the stories you want to tell. There are also some confounding variables like the time and money available to you. They are shaped by the people who work on them. A different curator to me would probably identify a different story. A different designer would suggest a different layout. Churchill in the Middle East was an intensely difficult exhibition, the complexity of the story being compounded by the small space. Even so, it was a stimulating challenge, and I hope provided an opportunity to exhibit some rare and extraordinary objects. I hope that once the present pandemic is consigned to history, you'll all get a chance to come and see them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian, and I think you've whetted lots of appetites there, and I hope it won't be long before people do get the chance to come and visit again. That was a great show and tell, and it was a fantastic way of taking the story through from 1921 until the end of Churchill's life in 1965. Now, obviously, it is a huge challenge to interpret these very complex historical issues for a modern audience, not least, of course, because they remain controversial and contested, as you and several of our speakers have made clear. One historian who I think is on this call this afternoon, Dr. Christopher Catherwood, based in Cambridge, titled his book on the creation of Iraq, Churchill's Folly. And I suppose one of the things that we can now explore in the Q&A is to what extent the panel feel the results of 1921 ultimately were folly. How successful was the conference for Churchill, for Bell, for Lawrence, and what did they come to feel about it afterwards? But we've got lots and lots of questions coming in. So if I can ask all of our panelists to unmute themselves and to appear back on screen. And I think we'll start with a question from Christopher Catherwood. And Christopher asks, how much difference did the negotiations pre-Cairo between Lloyd George and Clemenceau for the French make? And he points out that what is now the northern part of Iraq was originally intended for Syria, and the French, Lloyd George persuaded Clemenceau to give that region to Britain instead. So how much of today's Iraq is Churchill at Cairo, and how much is Churchill able to take advantage of Lloyd George's earlier talks? And perhaps direct that maybe at Rob first.
Thanks so much. There was a lovely moment actually where Lloyd George and Clemenceau are in a room together. We don't have the full record because I think there was only one other witness. And Lloyd George was very pointed in saying, we want Mosul. Apparently Clemenceau nearly shrugged his shoulders in sort of Gallic way and said, okay, d'accord. And then Lloyd George sort of followed up very quickly by saying, and we also want Palestine. And to which Clemenceau also said, okay, fine, that makes no difference to me. And I think Lloyd George was so puzzled, he asked George Clemenceau why he wasn't sort of offering the usual French resistance to any British proposal about the Middle East. And apparently Clemenceau said, I'm not really that interested. You know, my priority is France after the First World War, reconstruction of France. And political reconstruction of that is not just kind of reconstruction physically. And he said that the only reason that France had been involved in Syria at all was because of this lobby that I mentioned, the Committee d'Azil, the nationalist colonial lobby in French politics. He had to simply placate them with Syria. So I think the first answer to this question is that Churchill does indeed inherit what Lloyd George had discussed with Clemenceau. But I think the British concerns were very different from the French concerns. The primary British concern was that the northern portion of Iraq, closest to the old adversary Turks, should in some way be protected. And if a barrier could not be created by weak Arabian states, or if France would not consider it, and after all, the French were being driven out of Syria and southern Anatolia, which they had their eye on because of Turkish nationalist resistance, then of course, Britain felt that it had to somehow take on that territorial acquisition. That's where that part of the story comes in. Now, of course, there are many other parts of the story which I'll leave to my colleagues about the questions of the protection of the head of the Persian Gulf, which was the most important part. The Indian government being interested in the center of the country of central Iraq because of its potential agricultural development. Then there's all the issues about transportation. Faisal himself, when he takes over as king, of course, has ideas that road construction, oil pipelines will provide, as the Roman Empire done, the sinews, the connections, bring together the Arabian people. None of those aspirations, of course, were fulfilled. We can come back to, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues.
Okay. Warren or Ari, do you want to come in on this one? Warren, perhaps?
I'll go ahead and say, I think, first I can only echo Robert in that. I think Clemenceau's position was that again, he was just focused on France. I think he was happy to offload the responsibility, and maybe he had the slight premonition that there could be serious problems. Because remember, one of our first, this is after 1991, one of our first sort of uprisings is in Iraq.
If I can just interrupt for Warren a moment, I'm certainly encountering feedback on your vocals at the moment, and I wonder if I can just make sure if the rest of the speakers are muted while one of us speaks. Let's just see if that makes a difference.
Do I still sound like a robot? Sorry, you muted. I don't know if that's all right.
You sound as though you've got a very bad cold, basically. So maybe Ari, do you want to come in on this one?
I agree with Rob completely. I think he gave the authoritative answer on that. I mean, I certainly, it perhaps kind of is connected to this specific moment in which you do have the French still in the region, and a very short-lived American attempt that in the form of the King Crane Commission. So I think from my reading, part of what is happening during the Cairo conference and its immediate aftermath is that basically these international forces demarcate their areas both figuratively and literally, and it's very interesting to see how the very short-lived attempt of the U.S. to send a King Crane Commission is gone. It fades into thin air at the end of summer 1919, basically, and in a way we won't see serious American presence until after World War II.
That's fantastic. So I think you have started certainly to answer another one of the questions which has come in, which is can the panelists comment on the role of the United States in the Cairo conference and later in the 20s in the Middle East? You've clearly made it. Do you want to add to expand your remarks on that?
I think, I mean, as the U.S. as a U.S. government, I think, after the after the initial attempts, one cannot underestimate the impact President Wilson had, of course, in Paris. And the language of the 14 points is, of course, extremely important in understanding the vocabulary that the locals are using. But the US administration as an administration is not, you cannot see its presence in the region until you will see after World War II, the British starting to feeling that they're fed up with the mandatory system. We do not know how to do it, and then you see an increasing American presence, first in the form of the Anglo-American Commission, and then later on when simply Britain says we are passing this problem to the United Nations. So from that moment on, you have a different political game in a different arena in which the U.S., especially under Truman, plays a much more significant role. But I think that maybe Churchill can be credited for that. The 1920s, it's very clear that who's the sheriff in town, and the Americans are definitely not there.
Okay, thank you very much. Leora, did you want to come in on either of these points? You're muted at the moment. You're still muted, I think, Leora.
Okay, good. Two observations of what I heard here. One is about the King Crane Commission and its effects in the area, meaning they had a lot of support from the population, but it came to nothing. And another observation, because I promised you that I would bring also the Arab viewpoint, on the Faisal Weizmann encounters, first at Aqaba and then in London. I think from what I read, Faisal was very enthusiastic of a kind of collaboration with the Jews and the Zionist movement, because he believed that it would also help propel the Arab cause. But so he saw it from a humanitarian viewpoint, also meaning having the Jews coming into Israel. But from the moment it became a political issue, so then he was very much, he didn't really support it. That should be said in order to be fair with Faisal as well. And okay, Israel is a political reality, so I think that we are strong enough to say that at the time what Faisal believed is that it would be just a humanitarian project and not a political one.
Okay, thank you very much. Warren, I can see you've reappeared on the screen with headphones. So do you want to come in on these questions?
I was getting the headphones, so I don't know what the last question was. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, I mean, obviously the first question was about which you heard, which was about the creation of Iraq, and actually how much of that had been decided prior to the Cairo conference, including the negotiations between Lloyd George and Clemenceau. The subsequent question was about the role of the United States and what role the United States was playing in these debates and questions.
I think I can just what I was going to say before my robot interference there, or dragon traffic kept me from making my comments, was that again, I think Robert gave the definitive answer, and Clemenceau was focused almost entirely on France, and was even maybe prophetic in that he was able to offload some things, because if we remember, shortly after the 1919, one of the first uprisings was actually in northern Iraq. And that's also where one of the sort of huge criticisms around colonial air policing takes place. And there's even, I'm sure you're well aware of all the accusations of Churchill calling for use of gas against natives and so forth that happened in northern Iraq initially. And then, of course, this all gets sucked into the creation or non-creation of Kurdistan after the fact. So I think, to come back to it, I think Clemenceau was just happy to be hands off.
Okay, so we've got a question, perhaps not surprisingly, about the role of oil. It appears that oil was not a factor in the calculus of Churchill and his advisors, which of course goes back to what you were talking about, Rob. However, the TPC was formed in 1914, and negotiations that led to the Red Line Agreement in 1928 started in 1921. Did Churchill knowingly ignore oil? So, you know, to what extent is oil a sort of a factor in all of this? And there must have been an awareness of the huge potential of oil in these regions. And of course, Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty prior to the First World War, had been hugely involved in converting the British fleet from coal to oil. So how does oil factor into all of this? And maybe if we start with you, Warren, on this one.
So it's interesting. I think you're correct, Alan, in saying that. I think it's a sort of, it plays a veiled role. I think for Churchill, he saw, you know, the majority of oil deposits were already known in what was Persia at the time. And so that's already sewed up for Great Britain. Now, of course, there is the potential for oil, and undoubtedly Churchill would have been aware of that. But primarily, that doesn't come into his focus until much later, even though these lines are moving. So the idea, this federated idea that we've been discussing is hugely important, because if they are independent, then they can also develop economic, i.e. oil relationships with Great Britain down the road. But in the immediate sense, I think Churchill felt like the oil situation was taken care of because of the relationship with Persia, which was, of course, a part of the British informal empire structure anyway.
And Leora, perhaps, how much does oil factor in Faisal's thinking?
Faisal's thinking not so much, but definitely at the conference they had already an idea of the potential of oil in Mosul. And that's also one of the clauses of the 1926 agreement on Mosul that finally set up the northern frontier of Iraq, was that an agreement with the TPC, and then after that the Iraqi oil company, would be a division of share that would also appease the French, because it has not been mentioned here, but the French had also their desire to have Mosul according to the Sykes-Picot agreement. It was theirs. It was in their zone of influence. So there was an arrangement between the British, the Turks, the Iraqis, and the French in order to divide the revenues of oil, and that's what permitted at the end the signing of the Mosul agreement and keeping Mosul within Iraq, which is still a problem to be discussed, because there are many historians that said that this was one of the most greatest errors of Gertrude Bell. She was very, very active in entertaining the League of Nations Committee and having them finally decide to support the inclusion of Mosul into Iraq.
Okay. And Rob, do you want to come in here?
Thanks very much. I agree entirely with Warren and Leora. They both mentioned quite rightly the importance of oil and the knowledge of it in both Persia and in Mosul right at the very, very end of the war. I think the problem we have is there's always a risk that we become anachronistic. We look back on the past and impose some kind of importance to something which is important to us today, but wasn't the most important factor at the time. Certainly in 1920, the most important factors were stability, so human concerns really about governance and stability. And far more important was access to the sea as the issues that needed to be debated about, you know, for example, Jordan, when it's first created, had no access to the sea. Aqaba comes later. The big question that Faisal raises when he still thinks he's going to be the king of Syria is that he wants he complains that he has a house with no door, the reference being to a lack of access to the sea, which because he thinks the entire seaboard is going to be handed over to France, including Lebanon, of course, as well. So there's a real question here about how do we, in the present day, look back at the past? And I think the answer always is to go back to the archives. I was very struck in the National Archives of the United Kingdom when there are officials debating the importance of oil or the importance of commerce, the importance of agriculture. There's this sort of rather dismissive remark that the oil industry is pretty small. Access, getting the oil out of the ground is expensive and technically quite difficult. And that the best oil industry still remains in Persia because of its access to the sea, the ease of getting it out. And therefore, it's not really a key concern until much, much later. Just as Warren says, it comes much later, and Ari was saying it's much later, it comes really in the 1930s and 40s, particularly during the Second World War. And that's when Churchill's entire posture about the Middle East changes, because he regards it as an existential threat. The Nazis are within reach of the Middle East and Middle Eastern oil. And if they get that, they've pretty much won the resource war.
Okay, and Ari, do you want to come in?
I agree with everything that was said. I think that in later years, especially when you have the Haifa refineries and the port, the significance changes, and there's also a symbolism that is associated with the Haifa port as the symbol of British presence and power in east of Suez. So you won't be surprised to see that in later stages, when you have contests and when you have a rising conflict, conflict tends to gravitate towards areas that have a symbolic meaning. So it's not a surprise that the refineries will become one of the sites in which you have clashes. But this is later on in the game, and of course, it always strikes me, and there are bigger experts on Churchill specifically on this call than myself, that to what extent maybe when Churchill changes his, shifts gears from being Lord of Admiralty to the Colonial Office, the focus, right? So maybe things that would have been so central to him when he's in charge of the fleet are becoming slightly secondary when he looks at things from the perspective of a colonial administrator.
I think that's a really valid point. And of course, we know that one of the things that Churchill was especially concerned about at this time, and I think probably regardless of what office he was holding, was the threat of Bolshevism and communism nationally and internationally. And I think this ties in with what you've said, Rob, that we need to think about what was important to Churchill and the others at the time. And one of the questions that has come in is, what about the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union in the region? Were they behind any revolts or conspiracies at this time? Who would like to come in on that one? Okay, Rob?
I'm sure Warren will have points about this too, about the troubled relationship with the Soviets, of course, throughout this entire period. One thing we should be aware of is that in 1920, there was a pretty significant conference as far as the communists were concerned at Baku for the so-called oppressed peoples of the East. Interestingly enough, the only Muslim population representatives who were there who were not cheering along the Bolsheviks were those who were actually living under Bolshevik occupation at the time. But there were a number of other nationalist or proto-nationalist, socialist groups that were represented at that conference from the Caucasus and indeed sort of elements of the Middle East. And they were pretty antagonistic against the British and indeed the French, and indeed all democratic powers, which they regarded as bourgeois entities who were there to oppress the working people. So there was a real sense of change in the Middle East and the results of the First World War, ideologically, politically. This was a period of great change and great ferment, if you like. And as far as the British were concerned, there were indeed conspiracies underway. The British had direct experience of this, not just with early communists trying to rouse Indian groups in British India against the Raj, but also in terms of the way the British had concluded their final mission, the so-called Trans-Caspia and Caspian Sea mission, which went to Baku at the very end of the First World War. Effectively, that British mission under General Dunstable was brought to an end because of a communist conspiracy, and the British had to withdraw in fairly quick order from that region. So they had every reason empirically to feel that communism was going to be one of the most important threats to British interests in the Middle East, and therefore, by extension, we should remember, to all of the Arab monarchs who they were trying to set up as independent, autonomous states who shared the same idea of a monarchical sort of approach to governance. So there was a real concern about it, definitely.
Okay, Leora?
Yeah, just an observation. If you remember the participants here, that in one of the letters that Lawrence wrote after the conference, and that illustrates how he was worried about the Russians, is that he finishes his letter by saying it was a terrible place, the Semiramis Hotel. It makes me Bolshevik.
Which presumably means that Churchill was certainly enjoying himself there. Warren?
Just a couple points to echo what Rob was saying. We absolutely know that Churchill was terrified of this, in part because of his thinking around the Middle East being this sort of bulwark against Russian and later Soviet expansion. But what's really interesting, and I'm going to do a little advertisement for you here, Alan, in the Mitrokhin archives, in the Churchill College archives that you have, some of the few bits that I've been able to actually go through and see, and also my Russian is basically non-existent, so I had help, is actual, which would have been NKVD things at the time, are actually them trying to run in operations, including in Baku. And this is in the Mitrokhin archive that is in your possession. And so we know that the Bolsheviks actually had their eyes. And one of the things Churchill was really afraid of was not maybe so much down in the Arab part of the world, but that in the former Ottoman Empire, particularly around the Turkish elements, because they were sort of, there's this whole idea that Mustafa Kemal or Ataturk would suddenly become a Bolshevik. And we do know that the Bolsheviks were also hoping that that was the case. Because of, and this is the evidence of this is in your archives. And so Churchill went around complaining, and you can see this in some of his letters to Lloyd George, of what he called Turco-Bolshevism, that there would be a term, which is very interesting because obviously Ataturk had no interest in Bolshevism at all. So it sort of exists as a specter, but it also did actually exist because they were trying to undertake operations.
Okay. Ari, do you want to come in?
Wonderful. I agree completely with Warren. I think that also, if we look at specifically the moment of the Cairo conference, we have to remember that despite the fact that there was already Soviet Russia, Bolshevik Russia, it's still torn by a ravaged civil war. So fears of communism spreading at that moment, at that specific moment, are very different from what we will see as Red Scare later on. We have to remember that among the locals, you do, of course, have socialist Zionists that are coming from Russia. And of course, and there is a communist party that would emerge in Palestine. So in the declassified intelligence files we have today, of course, we see the British mandatory officials and police monitoring, scared about it. Nevertheless, the great majority of these laborers, at least in the Zionist movement, so much of, I don't think it's only a rhetoric, it's really a strong belief. They actually look with much admiration at the mothership, which is the British Labour Party. So they see themselves, right? So I think that this is also part of the special relationship the Zionists are forging with Britain, maybe not to Churchill's taste, but even if you were a socialist Zionist, you admire the British Labour. And when British Labour figures and politicians would come to Palestine, they will be embraced and accepted as VIPs. Later on, the story becomes much more complicated. And one of the interesting elements that it's one of the, in Palestinian historiography, the Communist Party has a very ambivalent position and it has more to do with later years and the post-World War II years, because the communists were basically the only ones among the Palestinians that did accept the partition proposal. So they are looked at in a very ambivalent eye, with few minor exceptions. As far as I can recall, off the cuff without my research notes, we do not see in the major revolts, if you see the unrest, whether it's Nebi Musa, whether it's the Great Arab Revolt in the 1930s, the Great Arab Revolt is a huge concern, but this is not the civil war in Spain. The Soviets are not there pushing in and arming anyone. So it's a different type of clash, and it is also not perceived by the British as such. They tend to look at it as unrest, either on religious sect clashing, or later on really recognizing there is a nascent nationalist movement among the Palestinians. But communism in these specific unrests plays a very small role.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go with a couple of very quick questions now. So one to Ian. And that is the exhibition a permanent one? So you've obviously got people who are keen to visit.
Yes, I can say the exhibition Church of the Middle East is a permanent show, well, as permanent as anything is these days, and the Church of War Rooms reopens after lockdown on the 19th of May. So see you there soon.
Fantastic. And then to Leora, was Gertrude Bell treated as an equal among all the men she worked with? I imagine that's probably the subject for a book in its own right. But can you give us a quick answer on that one?
Sure. I think she made herself be treated as an equal, and there is one of her letters after the invitation she got from Dobbs, who succeeded Sir Percy Cox as High Commissioner in Iraq. And he asked her if she wanted to come to a dinner that was exclusively male. So then she answered him that I am a British officer, so I am sexless. I can come wherever I am invited to.
Excellent. Okay, and then before we go to the sort of closing remarks, I just want to go around the panel again very quickly because I'm conscious of the time. And I just want you to ask, I mean, looking at the sort of situation in the Middle East today, what would you say was the main legacy of the Cairo conference and the events that we've been discussing? And just as I say, just very quickly, Ari?
I think if we look at borders, we still see a lot of it. I mean, so if we just read the papers, we tend to forget that even the entity that is called Palestine is carved in at the Cairo conference, and then later on in the 1922 white paper in which Churchill plays a central role. So although the name Palestine exists earlier, just the conception, the geographic conception of an entity between River Jordan and the Mediterranean is a British, and one would even argue a very Churchillian kind of a conception. And that is also divided from Transjordan, which is the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan today. So even if we look at borders, and even if we follow the propaganda of an insurgency like ISIS, that they see themselves as turning the wheel of history backwards, trying to erase these borders, in a way, it shows you some of these remaining legacies.
Okay, Ian, do you want to come in on this one? Because you've in a sense, your exhibition started with the Cairo conference, and then looked at sort of what came out of that.
Well, I suppose one of the pieces of media that I looked at when I was doing my research was an awards dinner hosted by the British Technion Society, so the British branch of the Israeli Technical University, awarding the Winston Churchill Prize to King Hussein of Jordan. Presented by Mary Soames to the king, and King Hussein spoke very movingly on that occasion about the shared history of his family, of their two families, and I think there is the continuing existence of the Hashemite royalty in Jordan would seem to be one of the longest living legacies of the conference. I think in general, what strikes me about Churchill's 1921 vision is how firmly it sticks in his mind. He constantly returns to it over and over again, and he uses Lawrence's endorsement as a kind of a seal or an imprimatur of approval. I think there was a question in the chat, what would Churchill think today? Well, I think Churchill would probably, if he was still 150 years old, I imagine he would still struggle to shake himself free of that initial Lawrencean approval of his ideas.
Okay. Leora?
Yes, I'd like to raise some thoughts here because I was very impressed by a young Iraqi historian whom I heard in one of the webinars last week. And from what she said, what is going on in Iraq today is very much, it reminds me very much of the legacy of the 1921 conference in Cairo. First of all, the stability of monarchies versus republics. The role of strong and or inspired leaders in the state's question for stability. The reassessment of values in a post-secular era. And last but not least, a glimpse at the moment. And from the point of view of younger historians, from young Iraqi scholars, I learned that there is a renewed quest for stability and for a post-sectarian Iraq. And there is very much nostalgia for the very times described by Gertrude Bell in her many letters and memoranda.
Rob?
It's an extremely difficult question to answer. I mean, I think what you're asking for, in a sense, is a verdict on the conference itself. I think it was a brave attempt to settle Southwest Asia, at least territorially. But of course, I think, what I would suggest as an historian who's spent my lifetime looking at this problem is that I don't think we can judge the protagonists on the basis of what we know were the outcomes, because they could not have known that. They could not have foreseen the, for example, the militaristic coup d'etat of the Ba'ath Party over Iraq. They could not have foreseen the 1967 war between Arab states and Israel. These things are just, it would be impossible for us to judge them on that basis. What I do think is that you should remember the conference itself was on extremely sandy foundations, in the sense that there were enormous hopes and therefore disappointments. I think there were very deep suspicions and fears about the future. And I think there were some really significant antagonisms, old antagonisms, and divisions which resurfaced both at the time and of course immediately afterwards, and then in the longer term.
Okay. And Warren, the last word goes to you.
Well, I'm going to be quite boring about it. I think if we look today at what's going on, and we can point at the Cairo conference as an enormously important historical moment, because to me, the real crisis that's happening is Western modernity is being forced on a region that isn't interested in it, in my opinion. And as a result of not really knowing what to do with the void that the Ottoman Empire left once it collapsed, the West tries to impose various things. And I think Rob's right to say it's wrong for us to look at the causality of how they tried to fix that problem and then say, oh, well, this was clearly not going to work. There was a clear belief from people like Churchill that they thought the Jewish community and the Arab community in Palestine, for example, would work together and that this would create a great unity for him. And trying to solve this problem about what do you do with the collapsed Ottoman Empire has been the recurring theme of the 20th and now 21st century. And so I think it's absolutely correct that all we can do is try to learn from this moment and look at how we can try to solve the problems today.
Well, on a positive note, that keeps historians and archivists in business and museum curators. So on that note, I mean, I don't think we have solved anything today, but I don't think we were trying to solve anything today. We've only had 2 hours. Churchill and co had more than 2 weeks, and their legacy, as we've heard, is still being debated and contested. To give the concluding remarks and the vote of thanks, I want to call on Mr. Lee Pollock, who has now appeared on our screens. He is the former executive director of the International Churchill Society and now a trustee in the US. And I think it's fair to say that this event grew out of Lee's passion and interest in this subject, and that we wouldn't be gathered online today without his enthusiasm and his Churchillian refusal to allow this centenary to pass unmarked. So Lee, over to you.
Thank you, Alan. What a fascinating program we've had today. And we all know we've just scratched the surface of this very interesting subject. Alan, you've assembled a wonderful panel for us. On behalf of the Churchill Society and our board, thank you for all the effort that went into this. We had over 1,000 people registered for today's program from the UK, the US, Europe, the Middle East, and other countries. So we couldn't be more pleased with the turnout and the interest this has generated. And we're equally delighted that both the Churchill Archive Center and the Judaic Studies program at George Washington University in Washington, DC have been the co-sponsors. And as Alan mentioned, creating these programs takes support. So we're very grateful to have had the assistance of the LL&P philanthropies to make this event possible today. We've had a wonderful group of speakers who've been perceptive and engaging in your remarks. And this has been an excellent overview of this centenary. So thank you all for making this such an interesting occasion. So Warren, Ari, Rob, Leora, Ian, we hope to have you participate in other events with the Churchill Society in future. As Alan mentioned, the Middle East in general, and in particular the Cairo Conference and Winston Churchill's subsequent visit to Palestine have been interests of mine for a long time. That's been enhanced more recently because my daughter just finished a master's degree at SOAS in London in Middle East Studies and Arabic, and previously was an intern at the American University in Cairo and at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington. My wife and I think have been to Cairo probably 7 or 8 times now, not for the last couple of years, unfortunately, and we do miss it. Even the constant honking of horns, which those of you who have been to Cairo will know is an incessant feature of life there. And I've also been able to spend time in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Ramallah, Amman, places that Churchill knew as part of the Mandate of Palestine and the Kingdom of Transjordan, which he was so concerned about 100 years ago. When we started thinking about how to commemorate this centenary a few years ago, we were hoping to have a big in-person conference and exhibit, a black tie dinner, and COVID put an end to all those aspirations, but we're certainly delighted to have had this program here today, which has been truly outstanding. And lastly, we hope everyone who's watching around the world will become a member of the Churchill Society. You can receive our Churchill Bulletin monthly for free, but if you become a paid member, either digital or in print, you'll get access to all the resources of our fantastic website, invitations to our events and programs, lots of other valuable things, and you'll support our work. It's all at winstonchurchill.org. Winston Churchill once said, "The further you look back, the further forward you can see." I think we all know that the lessons of history are more important in today's challenging world than ever, so we hope you'll join us in supporting the things that we do. Our next program, in fact, is coming up on Tuesday next week. Richard Toy and Felix Kloss talking about another interesting subject, Churchill and Europe. Details on that are on our website. So to all of you, wherever you are in the world, good afternoon or good evening. Thank you for joining us. And we do hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.